Teacher pours super glue on black boy's hair, not knowing his father is the principal. Sometimes, what hurts most isn't a slap, but a look, a silent gaze, loaded with prejudice. On the first Monday of August, Springfield Middle School bathed in the faint sunlight of a summer not yet over. The old brick buildings, coated in a sleepy red hue, slowly awakened after the long break. Inside room 203, desks had been cleaned, textbooks neatly stacked, and the whiteboard still bore chalk marks from last year's final day. At the third row by the window, a black boy sat quietly, gently running his fingers along the edge of a fresh, 7th grade biology book, its pages still smelling of new ink. That was Di, 12 years old, with deep black eyes and tightly twisted locks. Not for style, but heritage. Hair his grandmother had braided throughout the night while recounting their family's history. People who had once fought for their descendants to learn without fear. He was the new kid, new to the school, new to the city. Di's family had just moved from Detroit to this nearly all-white school district. His father, Mr. Robert, had just taken over as Springfield's new principal. But in a quiet agreement between the three of them, Di, his grandmother, and Mr. Robert, they kept that relationship a secret. Not out of shame, but because Di wanted to make friends, to be seen for who he was, not as the principal's son. And in that silence, as the bell rang at 7:55, the classroom door swung open, and stepped Mrs. Sandra Matthews, the new homeroom teacher, in her early 50s, with dark blonde hair, a pastel dress, and a face carefully made up. She beamed brightly, waving at the students as though she'd taught them for 10 years. But when her eyes scanned the rows and landed on the boy with the locks, the smile flickered. For a second. Maybe 2. Quickly she moved on as if nothing had happened. "Good morning, class," Mrs. Matthews said loudly, her tone slightly sharp. "I'm Mrs. Matthews. This is going to be a great year." Then she picked up the class roster and began calling roll. "Jonathan. Here. Maria. Here. Edsel. Here. Di." She paused. "Di?" The final syllable drawn out, as if testing the pronunciation of a foreign language. "Yes, ma'am," Di replied softly. She nodded and moved on. No smile. No, "Nice to meet you," like the others received. Just a curt nod, cold as stone. Di felt it. He had seen that look before, in the old bakery, when the cashier placed the check in front of his father, but called the white man behind them, "Sir." A gaze that made no noise but weighed like granite. Edsel, the brown-haired boy next to him, glanced over and offered a small smile. "I'm Edsel. You're new here, right?" Di nodded, replying with a grateful look. A flicker of light in an otherwise uneasy morning. The class carried on with introductions to classroom rules, reward systems, and the upcoming test schedule. But Di couldn't take his eyes off Mrs. Matthews, who laughed and joked with other students, yet subtly avoided his gaze whenever possible. No one in that classroom knew that just a few blocks away, inside the principal's office, Di's father, Mr. Robert, was pinning up posters with slogans like, "Safe schools, every student deserves respect." No one knew that the quiet boy in the third row was the son of the man leading this school. And in that very moment, a tiny crack, thin as chalk dust, began to form in Di's heart. He didn't know it yet, but his heart was already beginning to remember. Every look, every wordless silence. An intense and powerful story is just beginning to unfold. To follow the rest of it, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the gripping stories from Black Strength Stories. The second day at Springfield Middle School began with a small hope in Di's heart that today would be different from yesterday, that maybe Mrs. Matthews had just been tired or wasn't yet familiar with the new students. But that hope was quickly swept away like a dry leaf in a strange gust of wind. In the first period, Mrs. Matthews asked the class to write a short essay about their summer vacation or a memorable experience. Di sat up straight, carefully writing about his trip to the Science Museum in Detroit with his grandmother and father. He described in detail the solar system exhibit, where he had stood mesmerized for hours reading about the Cassini satellite and molecular water reaction models. He shared his dream of becoming an astrophysicist, someone who would contribute to discovering habitable planets. Di structured his essay in 3 clear paragraphs, used age-appropriate academic vocabulary, and even included a famous quote from Carl Sagan: "Somewhere, something incredible is waiting to be known." When the assignment was returned, a large, bright red comment slashed across the top like a wound. "Lacks authenticity. Yedi bolu yirmi no feedback. No corrections. Just a single remark. Be more honest about your experience." Meanwhile, Edsel's essay, Di's first friend, was a mere 10 handwritten lines about a local fishing trip and eating egg sandwiches. Edsel received a 17, along with the note. Simple, but heartfelt writing. Di stayed silent. He looked at his paper, then at Edsel's. It wasn't jealousy. It was helplessness. As if all his efforts were dismissed with a single red pen stroke. After literature came art class. The theme was, draw a portrait of someone who inspires you. Di chose to draw his grandmother. He raised his hand, asking for more reddish-brown paint to color her hair. His arm stayed up for 4 minutes, but Mrs. Matthews ignored him. Meanwhile, she walked over to other students' desks, helping them mix colors, adjust lines, and even patting the head of a blonde girl who had accidentally smudged blue paint on her hand. When Di walked toward the supplies table to borrow a pencil sharpener, Mrs. Matthews blocked him with a cold tone. "Wait your turn." After Jared, Savannah, and Caleb, Di looked around. None of the 3 had made any move to sharpen their pencils. A silent doubt began to stir inside him. All these repeated little things, the cold stares, the unequal help, the biased grading, were they truly just coincidences? After class, when Edsel waved goodbye, Di offered a weak smile. He tried to keep his face neutral, but inside, a slow-burning sense of unfairness was building. Di walked home in silence, saying nothing to his father. He was afraid to disappoint him, because his father was doing his best as the new principal. Because they had both agreed Di wouldn't rely on his father's position to be treated differently. But the truth was, he was being treated differently, just not in the way they'd hoped. And it wasn't coming from his peers, but from the very person who was supposed to ensure fairness in the classroom. Another quiet evening began. Di slid his essay into his desk drawer, staring at the glaring red comment as if it were an accusation. Lacks authenticity. He thought to himself, maybe to Mrs. Matthews, a black boy's experience at a science museum is just too hard to believe. From the second week onward, the favoritism and prejudice in Mrs. Matthews's classroom could no longer be dismissed as accidental. They had become so blatant that even the most naive students began to notice. In Monday morning's math period, Mrs. Matthews called Di to the board to solve a 2-step equation. He wrote the solution in under a minute. 3x plus 7 equals 16 implies 3x equals 9 implies x equals 3. It was correct, clear, and logically sound. But instead of nodding in acknowledgement, Mrs. Matthews simply said coldly, "Sit down," without a word of praise, without a single clap. A few students in the front row, including Edsel, furrowed their brows at one another. 10 minutes later, it was Lisa's turn, a white girl with bouncy blonde hair. She went up to solve a different equation and got both steps wrong, writing 3x plus 7 equals 16 equals 6. But instead of pointing out her errors, Mrs. Matthews gently said, "That's okay. You're making great progress. I like the way you present your work." Then she led the class in a round of encouraging applause. The injustice began to thicken the classroom air. Di sat still, quietly erasing his work in his notebook, trying to swallow the lump in his throat. In the Friday presentation period, the theme was my family. Di carefully prepared a short speech about his grandmother, a civil rights activist in Mississippi during the 1960s, who had been arrested 3 times for participating in protests against the Jim Crow laws. He even brought an old photo, his grandmother in a gray coat, standing in front of a half-burned black church, holding a sign that read, "Justice Now." But barely a minute into his presentation, Mrs. Matthews raised her hand to interrupt. "That's enough, Di. Let's leave time for the others." He nodded and quietly packed up his notes. 5 minutes later, it was Caleb's turn, a popular student in class. He rambled on about his summer horse riding trip in Montana with his uncle. No visual aids, no standout content, but Mrs. Matthews beamed and praised. "So vivid. I felt like I was there with you." Edsel turned to Di and subtly shook his head. It was the first time Di had seen Edsel visibly upset. But the worst wasn't in the classroom. It was outside, in the teacher's lounge. One day, while waiting at the printer, history teacher Mr. Hughes overheard Mrs. Matthews complaining. "I don't get why he keeps trying to prove something. That hairstyle just scares people. Why can't he wear his hair like normal kids?" The hairstyle she referred to, those carefully braided locks, was the very one Di's grandmother had lovingly done for him, a proud traditional symbol of the African American community. Mr. Hughes shared what he heard with Ms. Annie, the art teacher, who had also seen Di being ignored in class the other day. They began to ask themselves, was this just strictness, or was it a deep-seated bias? More and more, the signs became undeniable, not just once, but repeatedly. Over and over. Every glance, every word, every deliberate omission. Di felt it, and he knew this was no longer just a personal feeling. This was a reality everyone could see, but no one had yet dared to speak about. No one had yet dared to act. But someone would eventually stand up. It just wasn't time yet. Mr. Chen, the 7th grade science teacher, had been teaching at Springfield Middle School for 18 years. He wasn't one to interfere in others' business. But what was happening in classroom 203 had reached a point where he could no longer stay silent. At first, he noticed it while passing by the hallway. Di sitting at the back of the room, his gaze cast downward, while the other students chatted cheerfully in groups. One day, Mr. Chen deliberately stepped into Mrs. Matthews's class at 9:15 a.m., using the excuse of borrowing a tape measure, even though his lab already had 3. Mrs. Matthews flinched at the sight of him, and her scolding mid-sentence was instantly cut short. The students looked up, and the eyes of 3 or 4 of them seemed to silently plead, trying to say something their mouths dared not speak. From that day on, Mr. Chen began finding excuses to show up at room 203 more often, to borrow chalk, to fetch a chair, to check the projector room schedule. Every time he stepped in, he felt the quiet tension in the air, as if the entire class was holding its breath. And gradually he realized, it wasn't the classroom that was afraid. It was the fear of the person standing at the front. Di kept trying. In Mr. Chen's science class, the young student excelled. His project, Closed Ecosystem Using Recycled Plastic Bottles, was chosen for display on the honor board of the entire grade. He meticulously presented the water filtration process using layers of sand, activated charcoal, and small pebbles, earning admiration from the whole class. Though shy, his word choices were precise and mature beyond his years. Not only that, one of Di's hand-drawn diagrams, illustrating the water cycle in vibrant colors and vivid details, was selected by the art teacher to be exhibited in the main hallway for 3 consecutive weeks. Even other teachers, like Ms. Annie from music or Coach Samuel from PE, praised Di for being well-mannered, helpful to classmates, and always attentive. Yet in Mrs. Matthews's class, Di's grades mysteriously began to plummet. From a B+ on his first assignment, he was given a C- on a descriptive essay about his home. Then came a D on a spelling test, even though the marked mistakes were in complex words like miscellaneous and archaeology, terms rarely used in the 6th grade curriculum. Mr. Chen quietly began backing up Mrs. Matthews's digital gradebook every week as a precaution. He said nothing, but his eyes, having witnessed generations of students, recognized that an abnormal pattern was forming. At home, Di began to change too. He ate less, often just picking at the dinners his grandmother cooked. Many times he would sit alone in the garden, staring at his workbook, flipping through the pages to recheck the mistakes that Mrs. Matthews had marked. "Am I a bad student?" he asked once, while his grandmother was washing dishes. She turned around, startled. It was the first time she saw her grandson doubt himself. Worse still, he began having recurring dreams of being given failing grades, being locked in a dark classroom, or being mocked for his hair. The nightmares returned 3 nights in a row. One morning, Di spoke in a barely audible voice. "Can I skip school today?" His grandmother simply pulled him into a hug, asking nothing more. But she knew. Something at that school was slowly wounding her grandson, piece by piece. And in a staff meeting room just 2 buildings away, Mr. Chen was writing a detailed report, listing specific times and observations of the troubling behavior in room 203. The final sentence he wrote was bolded. "I believe an impartial review is necessary. If not, one student may lose faith in himself forever." Wednesday brought shifting winds, and the art class buzzed with the sound of scissors, snipping paper, and the soft giggles of students preparing for the fall festival. Di sat in the far left corner, carefully cutting out red-orange leaves for his group's Tree of Hope project. His locks were neatly tied back, adorned with small wooden beads, what his grandmother lovingly called the crown of wisdom. Mrs. Sandra Matthews walked around the room with a hard gaze, holding a bottle of glue. When she approached Di, she stopped. The pause lasted longer than usual. Her eyes scanned him, hesitating. Then, without warning, she opened the cap. No one was prepared for what happened next. In one lightning-quick motion, she tilted the glue bottle and poured it directly onto the top of Di's head. A stream of thick, colorless liquid with a sharp, acetone-like odor spilled across his hair. The entire class froze. Di shot up, stunned. He didn't scream, didn't cry. He just gasped, as though all the air had been sucked from his lungs. His trembling hands reached for his head. His hair began to stiffen, clumping together in hardened patches. Mrs. Matthews stepped back, feigning panic. "Oh my! I thought it was regular glue! I grabbed the wrong bottle!" But Edsel jumped to his feet, pointing. "No, that wasn't regular glue. You got it from the special cabinet." Emmy, a white student, shouted to back him up. "We saw it! You used a key to open that cabinet." The cabinet students weren't allowed to touch, the cabinet that stored hazardous materials. And that bottle, an industrial adhesive used only for wood and metal models, was never meant for classroom crafts. Another student pulled out their phone and started recording. A small boy at the back of the room whispered, "She did it on purpose." Soft sobs began to echo from one corner of the classroom. Di stood motionless, eyes glistening with tears. He said nothing. Every sound seemed to vanish from the room, leaving only the pounding of rapid breath and the sharp sting of chemicals cutting straight to the heart. Mrs. Matthews tried to restore order. "Everyone, keep working. I'll call the nurse." but no one moved. The door burst open. Mr. Chen appeared as if he had sensed it. Seeing the scene before him, his face went pale, and he rushed to Dai's side. "Are you all right? Don't touch your hair. We need to wash it off right now." He guided Dai out of the room while the students looked around at each other, not with confusion anymore, but with fear, anger, and disbelief. Meanwhile, Mrs. Matthews remained where she stood, hands gripping the glue bottle, eyes hollow and vacant. She didn't yet realize that what she had poured on Dai's hair was about to stick to her career forever. As the classroom remained engulfed in chaos, Edsel, the boy with worn-out sneakers, sprinted down the long hallway, breath ragged, hand barely managing to knock on the nurse's office door before shouting, "It's serious, Ms. Baker. Someone poured superglue on Dai's head." Ms. Baker, the school nurse who had served Springfield Middle for over 12 years, leapt from her chair, grabbing her emergency kit and a pair of medical gloves. By the time she reached the hallway, Mr. Chen was already halfway to the infirmary, supporting Dai as he clutched a towel pressed over his head. On the towel, a stiff, crusted patch shimmered with a silvery sheen of drying chemicals. The sharp chemical stench reached Ms. Baker before she even got close. "Bring him inside now. Don't touch his hair anymore," she instructed, swiftly turning on the sink, preparing a neutralizing solution, and slipping on gloves. Her expression was tense, lined with concern. As she carefully removed the glue-matted hair, Dai let out a faint groan. His scalp had begun to redden, an early sign of chemical burns. She took photos to document the injury for medical records. "This glue. There's no way anyone could mistake it for regular craft glue," she murmured to herself. "This is industrial-grade cyanoacrylate, meant only for heavy model construction." Meanwhile, Mr. Chen was already striding toward the administrative office. In his hand, a flash drive containing student-recorded footage from 2 different angles, one capturing Mrs. Matthews unlocking the restricted cabinet and retrieving the glue, the other unmistakably showing her deliberately pouring it onto Dai's head. Not a trace of confusion, no indication of an accident. Inside the office, Principal Robert Dai's father had just wrapped up a meeting on semester budgeting. One look at Mr. Chen's fierce expression and the USB in his hand, and he knew something serious had occurred. "Watch this. Right now," Mr. Chen said, plugging the drive into the office projector. Seconds later, the room fell into suffocating silence. Mr. Roberts stood slowly, wordless, his face hardened. What he saw wasn't just misconduct, it was an act of violence committed within the walls of his school, and the victim was his son. The news spread faster than any internal email ever could. Within an hour, the footage had been shared across the student network, then spilled onto public platforms. The hashtag #Justice for Dai began trending on Twitter, TikTok, and Facebook. In just 2 hours, it had amassed over 17,000 shares. Parents began calling the school directly, demanding explanations. Down the hall, a group of teachers had gathered, some covering their mouths, others silently crying. One veteran teacher whispered, "We let her teach here for 14 years. How many other kids went through this without anyone noticing?" Another, pale and shaken, replied, "We've been silent for far too long." Meanwhile, Dai sat quietly in the nurse's office, a light cloth wrapped around his head, eyes wide as if still trying to process whether what happened was even real. Beside him sat Edsel, hand clasping his, saying nothing, simply being there, his presence a silent declaration. "I'm here." Ms. Baker closed her logbook, stood up, and spoke firmly. "I'm submitting this report directly to the Department of Education. This cannot be handled internally." The crisis had truly begun, but this time, The truth would no longer be hidden behind the classroom door. The door to the nurse's office opened with a sharp, hollow click. Light from the hallway spilled in, and standing in the doorway was a tall figure in a white dress shirt, still streaked with bits of chalk dust. Mr. Robert, the principal of Springfield Middle School. The moment his eyes met the child sitting quietly with gauze wrapped around his head, time seemed to stop. Di looked up, his eyes brimming with tears, yet he forced a brave smile. "Dad," he whispered, voice trembling but unbroken. Mr. Robert didn't respond immediately. He stepped closer, sat beside his son, and placed a hand gently on Di's shoulder. His eyes focused on the red mark on Di's forehead, the very place where, just hours earlier, a teacher had tried to destroy a child simply because of her prejudice. And then, like a switch flipping on, Mr. Robert stood. Each of his steps echoed across the floor like thunder. He picked up the phone and called the school's HR department directly. "Replace the teacher for Class 203 immediately. Mrs. Matthews is to be placed on administrative leave, effective now." He demanded the formation of an independent investigative committee consisting of representatives from the Department of Education, the district's legal counsel, and 2 non-staff parents. Meanwhile, Sandra Matthews was summoned to the waiting room. When she saw Mr. Robert walk in, her face turned pale as paper. Her eyes flicked nervously toward the security camera mounted in the corner of the administrative office, a place where denial had no refuge. "Principal Robert," she stammered. I didn't know." "There's no need for more lies," he replied, voice calm but ice cold. "The fact that you didn't know Di is my son doesn't change the truth, and it doesn't lessen your responsibility. You poured industrial glue on the head of a child under 13 years old, in a classroom, in front of multiple witnesses and a camera." He laid a stack of documents on the table, copies of the medical report, images of the injury, 2 student-recorded videos, and statements from the nurse and fellow teachers. Everything has already been forwarded to the district office and the State Department of Education. Outside the school gates, the situation was quickly spiraling beyond internal control. Parents, having already seen the video circulate on TikTok and Facebook, were arriving in waves. One mother held up a sign, "Protect our kids. No racists in the classroom." Another father shouted, "We send our children here to learn, not to be humiliated." Local news station KWP9 was first on the scene, followed by Channel 3 and national network MSNBC. Over 10 satellite trucks lined up along the school fence, cameras aimed at the main entrance. One reporter announced live, "Springfield Middle School, where a teacher is accused of assaulting a student with chemicals, has become the epicenter of community outrage." Back in the nurse's office, Di still sat in silence. He looked through the window and saw the growing crowd outside. But he didn't know that in just a few hours, the hashtag #Justice for Di would become the #1 trending topic on Twitter nationwide, with over 250,000 shares in a single day. Mr. Robert re-entered the room, this time no longer as a principal, but as a father. He knelt beside his son, held his hand, and whispered, "I'm sorry I didn't protect you sooner, but I promise, from this day forward, no one will hurt you without facing consequences." The boy nodded softly. No words of thanks were needed. It was enough to know that the truth had finally come to light. An emergency meeting of the Springfield Board of Education was held at 8 p.m. in Operations Room No. 5 on the ground floor of the district headquarters. In less than 48 hours since the incident occurred, more than 70 emails from parents, students, and former teachers had flooded the system. Public pressure left no room for evasion. This time, everyone understood. This was no longer just a classroom incident. It was an investigation into the slow decay festering within the system. Board Chairwoman Lila Monroe opened the session with a voice that was tense, yet resolute. We are not just confronting an individual failure, we are confronting the question: how many times have we stayed silent when this happened again and again? Footage from classroom 203, extracted early that morning, clearly showed Sandra Matthews retrieving a glue bottle from the faculty locker, walking toward Di, leaning down, and pouring it directly onto his hair. There was no sign of accidental mishandling. The video captured the frightened whispers of students and the icy stare of Mrs. Matthews as she stepped back. In addition, 41 students from the class, over 80% of the roster, submitted handwritten accounts, 1 to 3 pages long, describing Mrs. Matthews' systematic behavior over the past several months. Many reported that she regularly altered Di's grades in suspicious ways, erasing correct answers on his tests, claiming his submitted work was missing, or marking him as incomplete, despite witnesses confirming otherwise. A summary from the Office of Educational Complaints revealed that over 5 years, Mrs. Matthews had been reported at least 12 times for discrimination, unfair grading, and verbally demeaning students. Yet all cases had been archived with no formal action. Reasons cited included lack of direct evidence or inability to verify independent witnesses. This time, Mr. Chen, the science teacher, stood up and submitted 3 personal memos, proving he had reported to the administration at least 4 times. In the notes, he stated clearly, "The student named Di is being publicly discriminated against in class. The homeroom teacher displays clear favoritism that is severely affecting the student's well-being." He also noted that he had previously been warned not to interfere in classes that are not yours. The preliminary investigation results left the meeting room in stunned silence. This was not just an act of violence, but a series of violations against a child's rights, continuously ignored by the system. The board voted on the spot. All 9 members unanimously agreed to immediately suspend Mrs. Matthews, revoke her teaching license within the Springfield School District, forward the case to the State Department of Education, and initiate an interagency investigation. At the same time, the community erupted in response. At Graceway Church, just 2 blocks from the school, over 300 people gathered to pray for Di. They lit candles, read poetry, and held up signs. "My hair is not a reason for assault," and "We stand with Di." A student-led group called Justice for Di emerged on social media, gaining over 25,000 members in a single day. Posters featuring Di, his hair now trimmed short, his eyes still burning bright, appeared on street corners throughout the city. Peaceful protests began both in front of the school district headquarters and at the school entrance where Mrs. Matthews once taught, as if she were a model of virtue. But now, all the masks had fallen, and a system was finally forced to reckon with itself because of one 12-year-old boy, a bottle of glue, and a courage that refused to back down. 1 week after the shocking incident, the largest auditorium of the Springfield School District, usually reserved for graduation ceremonies or orientation days, was filled for a disciplinary hearing for the first time. In the front row, Di sat between his father, Mr. Robert, and his grandmother. His hands clutched the edge of his jacket, and his hair, still not fully regrown from the chemical damage, was gently covered by a light blue beanie, a quiet symbol of resilience. Both local and national media were in attendance. NBC, CBS, and CNN all sent reporters to cover the story. The headline on the large screen read, "Springfield School Decides Fate of Teacher Accused of Assaulting Student with Industrial Glue." The hearing lasted 3 hours. 11 people spoke, including students, teachers, parents, and school psychologists. detailing the prolonged pattern of behavior by Mrs. Matthews. One student said through tears, "I used to think I was being too sensitive, until I saw my friend with glue poured on his hair." Mr. Chen, the science teacher, stated firmly, "Silence is a form of complicity. I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner." After a 15-minute closed session, the board chair returned to deliver a brief but powerful verdict. Sandra Matthews is hereby permanently stripped of her teaching license at all public and private institutions statewide. This decision takes effect immediately. Applause broke out, not because someone had been punished, but because justice had finally broken a long silence. But the resolution didn't end there. Mr. Robert, though a father, remained true to his role as principal. In a meeting with the advisory board, he proposed a sweeping reform package, the establishment of an independent teacher oversight council, including parents, alumni, community representatives, and legal experts, a safe anonymous reporting system through a mobile app, locked mailboxes, and a 24/7 hotline, mandatory training sessions on implicit bias awareness, racial equity, and fair response strategies for all school staff, a Student Voice Week, where every student would be allowed to share their school experience with an independent counseling team, and the launch of the Di Robert Courage Award, an honorary scholarship for students who show courage in standing up for justice. 6 days later, during a community ceremony at Springfield Central Square, Di was honored. There was no grand podium or dazzling spotlight. He stepped forward in a simple white shirt, his eyes bright but slightly trembling. The crowd of over 600 people rose to their feet as he held the microphone. "I don't want anyone else to go through what I did," he said, his voice soft but unwavering. "Not because I'm special, but because I know I'm not the only one who's ever been treated unfairly." A young girl from elementary school came forward, holding a sign with shaky handwriting. "Thank you, Di. Because of you, my little sister will be safe when she starts school next year." Di bent down and received the sign as if it were a true Medal of Honor. Within just 10 days, Springfield Middle School, once heavily criticized by the media, had become a model for educational reform. Representatives from more than 17 other school districts came to study the new system. Schools in neighboring states began registering for the implicit bias training program led by Springfield's teachers. A short handbook, From Silence to Action, Lessons from Springfield School, was printed in 50,000 copies and distributed to every public library. And at the heart of all that change stood a 12-year-old black boy who didn't raise a fist, didn't shout in rage. He simply chose to stand his ground. Di never sought to become a symbol, but his humility, courage, and belief in doing what was right forced an entire system to transform. 6 months after Di's story shook the foundations of the Springfield education system, a peaceful early spring morning opened on the middle school campus. A gentle breeze passed through the glass panels, now covered in multicolored mosaic art. Images of students of every race, religion, and gender learning side by side, hand in hand, under the words, "We grow together through difference." Di walked slowly along the second-floor hallway, where a new mural painted by the art club had been completed, a large head of locks formed by words like pride, heritage, resilience, and I am me. He smiled. His hair, once mocked and attacked, had now become an inspiration for the entire school. After the glue incident, Di's hair had suffered severe damage. But thanks to a team of scalp specialists sent by a private sponsor, led by Grace Holloway, an Afro-textured hair restoration expert, his hair had recovered up to 85%. They used plant-based keratin therapy combined with natural herbs, and Di had been trained to help other children with hair care. He turned a painful past into a skill that inspires others. But Dai didn't stop there. He founded a small club called Hair Freedom in My Story. At the Unity Fair cultural event, his exhibit titled A Brief History of Black Hair in the Civil Rights Movement drew over 1,200 visitors on the first day. He displayed a photo of his grandmother, R., a leader in the 1968 protests, and how she tied her headscarf as a symbol of peaceful resistance. Every Monday after school, Dai and his father, Mr. Robert, sat in the principal's office to read feedback letters from students. One letter from a 5th grader proposed hosting a multicultural food day, explaining, "I want my mom to bring her red bean and banana dish to school without kids saying it smells weird." The letter was approved immediately. A week later, the dish was served to over 400 people in the school cafeteria, under a banner that read, "Food is a form of respect." Dai also joined the Big Brother program, mentoring 4 younger students. Each week, he helped them with homework, discussed how to deal with bias, and guided them in writing emotion journals. One student said, "I'm not scared to go to school anymore, because Dai told me it's okay to be different." By April, at a community gathering held at the city library, where protests against Mrs. Matthews had once taken place, Dai spoke publicly for the first time before over 600 people, including district principals, the mayor, and members of the press. He stepped up to the podium, no fancy microphone, just him, a child once deeply hurt. "I never wanted what happened to me to be the center of attention. But since it did, it has to lead to something good. Pain, if kept silent, turns into fear. But if we share it, if we turn it into a reason to act, then it becomes change." No one spoke for 3 seconds after that. Then the entire room rose to their feet in thunderous applause. A white woman holding her daughter approached, teary-eyed. "Thank you. My daughter, with her natural curls, no longer begs me to straighten her hair." That same day, the mayor announced a new scholarship, the Dai Robert Young Citizen Scholarship, awarded to middle school students across the city who take concrete action to improve their school environment. Dai, once a student overlooked, once a victim of a cruel act, was now a living symbol of hope, dignity, and lasting transformation. He didn't need to grow up too fast, but he had become a quiet yet unwavering spark, reigniting faith and justice within schools and beyond, in the broader community. A black child had industrial glue poured onto his hair in a classroom. It sounds like something from a disturbing movie. But it was the painful reality Dai lived through, right in the heart of the 21st century, at a school supposedly safe and fair. The real question is not just how a teacher could do such a thing, but what did the education system do, or fail to do, to prevent it? How many more students are still suffering in silence simply because of the color of their skin, the texture of their hair, or where they come from? Dai stood up, not just for himself, but for all the children who haven't found their voice yet. And what about you? Is silence still an option in the face of injustice? Hit like, subscribe to Black Strength Stories, and share this video, so together we can speak up for justice, for truth, and for a future where no one is mistreated simply for being who they are.